In a small town, life was usually calm, but one incident would change everything. A young girl named Emily, at the tender age of 14, found herself the victim of an unspeakable betrayal. Her mother, a woman more interested in her own image than her daughter's well-being, and the local barber, a man driven by greed and malice, conspired to humiliate Emily in a way that shocked the entire community. It all started on a seemingly normal day. Emily's mother, who we'll call Mrs. Thompson, dragged her into the barber shop. Emily, with her long, beautiful, wavy hair, which she cherished dearly, was unaware of the cruel fate awaiting her. "Sit down, Emily," Mrs. Thompson commanded, a cruel edge to her voice. "But Mom, why are we here?" Emily asked, fear creeping into her voice. "We're getting that hair cut off. It's too much trouble for you to handle." Mrs. Thompson snapped. The barber, Mr. Green, smirked as he prepared his tools. He had been promised a handsome amount for this job. As Emily sat in the chair, tears streaming down her face, the clippers buzzed to life. "Please don't do this, Emily," aged 14 pleaded. "Quiet, Emily." Her mother's voice was cold. "This is for your own good." The ordeal was over in minutes, but the emotional scars would last a lifetime. Emily was left with a shorn head, her once glorious hair now scattered on the floor. Word of this cruel act spread like wildfire. The townspeople were outraged. Local authorities soon got involved, and it wasn't long before Mrs. Thompson and Mr. Green were arrested. In the courtroom, the judge did not hold back. "Mrs. Thompson, Mr. Green, your actions were not only cruel but deeply inhumane. You are both sentenced to 5 years in prison. Furthermore, as a part of your punishment, your heads will be shaved bald for the duration of your sentence," the judge declared. The courtroom fell silent. The severity of the punishment shocked everyone present. Mrs. Thompson, unable to grasp the full extent of her downfall, began to plead with the judge. "Please, Your Honor, you must understand, I was only trying to help my daughter." Mrs. Thompson's voice trembled. "Help? By humiliating her in such a manner? Your actions were driven by selfishness and vanity, not concern for your daughter's well-being," the judge replied sternly. "But please, I beg you, reconsider, Mrs. Thompson pleaded, tears streaming down her face. "The sentence stands." The judge's voice was unyielding. "Bailiff, proceed." The bailiff approached Mrs. Thompson with a pair of electric clippers. Her eyes widened with horror as the reality of her punishment set in. She was forced to sit in a chair placed in the middle of the courtroom. The bailiff turned on the clippers, the buzzing sound echoing in the room. "Please, no," Mrs. Thompson cried, her voice desperate. The bailiff didn't hesitate. He placed the clippers at her forehead and began shaving her hair. Clumps of her once carefully styled hair fell to the floor. The spectators watched in stunned silence. The only sound the relentless buzzing of the clippers. Meanwhile, Mr. Green stood beside her, his face pale. He knew he would be next, and there was no escaping it. "Your turn," the bailiff said to Mr. Green, once Mrs. Thompson's head was completely shaved. "No, please," Mr. Green whispered, his voice barely audible. The bailiff repeated the process, shaving Mr. Green's head bald. When he was done, both stood before the judge, their heads bare, their dignity stripped away. "You will now be taken to prison," the judge continued, "where your heads will remain shaved for the duration of your sentence. Let this be a lesson to all who think they can act with such cruelty and go unpunished." As they were led out of the courtroom in handcuffs, the media captured every moment. The story of their heinous act and subsequent punishment spread across the nation. igniting widespread outrage and ensuring they would never escape their infamy. Once they arrived at the prison, the reality of their situation began to sink in. The guards, having heard the story, greeted them with a mixture of disgust and sternness. The news of their arrival had already reached the inmates, and the atmosphere was charged with tension. "Welcome to your new home," one guard said sarcastically as they were processed. "I hope you enjoy your stay." Another guard, his face twisted with contempt, added, "We've got a special place for people like you." Mrs. Thompson tried to maintain her composure, but fear was evident in her eyes. Mr. Green, on the other hand, looked pale and terrified, fully aware of the consequences awaiting him inside. As they were led to their cells, the whispers and murmurs of the other prisoners filled the corridors. "That's them," one inmate said, pointing. "Disgusting," another muttered. In her cell, Mrs. Thompson sat on the hard cot, her head still bald from the courtroom. She could hear the guards talking outside her door. "Did you hear what they did to that poor girl?" One guard said, "Yes, sickening." "I heard the judge shave their heads right there in court." "Good on him," the other replied. Mrs. Thompson's thoughts were consumed with regret and fear. She had lost everything, and now faced years of punishment and humiliation. The next morning, the prison routine began. Mrs. Thompson and Mr. Green were marched to the prison barber, where their heads were shaved again as a reminder of their crime. The humiliation was relentless. "Please, not again," she pleaded. But her cries were ignored. As the clippers buzzed, the barber, a grizzled inmate with a permanent scowl, muttered, "This is what you deserve." Days turned into weeks, and the hostility from the other inmates only grew. One day, as Mrs. Thompson was returning to her cell, she was confronted by a group of women. "So you thought it was okay to do that to your own daughter?" One woman sneered. "It wasn't like that," Mrs. Thompson said, her voice shaking. "I was trying to help her." "By shaving her head in front of everyone?" "You're worse than scum." Another woman spat, shoving her roughly against the wall. Meanwhile, Mr. Green's life in prison was a living nightmare. The inmates had not forgotten what he did, and they had their own plans for retribution. One evening, as he sat alone in his cell, a group of men approached him. "Hey, barber," one of them called out mockingly. Mr. Green looked up, fear etched on his face. "What do you want?" "We just want to make sure you never forget what you did," another man said, cracking his knuckles. Before he could react, they grabbed him, pinning him down. "Now you'll never hurt anyone else again," one of the men said coldly, leaving Mr. Green writhing in pain. The guards found him the next morning and rushed him to the infirmary, but the damage was done. He would never hold a hair clipper or scissors again. Years passed slowly for Mrs. Thompson and Mr. Green. Every day was a reminder of their crime. Their punishment a daily ritual of humiliation and regret. The outside world moved on, but their lives were frozen in that moment of cruelty and its aftermath. Finally, the day of their release arrived. Mrs. Thompson emerged from the prison gates, her head freshly shaved for the last time. She looked around, squinting against the bright sunlight she hadn't seen in years. Standing by the gate was Emily, now a beautiful, charming young woman with wonderful wavy hair that reached her hips. Emily's eyes were cold as she looked at her mother. "I will never forgive you," Emily, now 19, said, her voice filled with a quiet strength. Mrs. Thompson's heart sank. She had hoped, perhaps foolishly, for some sign of forgiveness. But it was clear that her actions had forever destroyed their relationship. "Emily, please." "I'm so sorry," Mrs. Thompson said, tears welling up in her eyes. It's too late for sorry, Emily replied, her voice steady. You can't undo what you did. Mrs. Thompson tried to reach out, but Emily stepped back, shaking her head. I don't want anything to do with you, Emily said firmly. The weight of her daughter's words hit Mrs. Thompson harder than any prison sentence could. As Emily walked away, Mrs. Thompson stood there, frozen and desolate. She had nowhere to go, no one to turn to. The harsh reality of her situation settled in as she wandered the streets, looking for a place to sleep, something to eat, or even a chance for work. But everywhere she turned, doors were closed to her. Desperation growing, she approached a diner, hoping to find a meal. Excuse me, could I possibly get something to eat? I don't have any money, she asked the owner, her voice trembling. The owner looked her up and down, recognition dawning on his face. Aren't you that woman from the news? The one who he trailed off, shaking his head. Yes, but please, I'm hungry, she pleaded. We don't serve people like you here. Get out, he said, turning his back on her. Her stomach growled in protest as she continued her search, eventually finding herself at a homeless shelter. Can I stay here for the night? She asked the volunteer at the front desk. The volunteer hesitated, clearly recognizing her. I'm not sure we have space, he said, looking around nervously. Please, I have nowhere else to go, she begged. Let me check, he said, disappearing into the back. He returned a few moments later, shaking his head. Sorry, we're full. Dejected, she wandered until she found a bench in a quiet park. As she sat down, tears streamed down her face. She felt utterly defeated, abandoned by everyone, including her own daughter. Days turned into weeks, and Mrs. Thompson's situation grew more dire. She approached a local business, hoping to find work. Is there any chance you're hiring? I can do anything. Clean? Stock shelves, whatever you need, she asked the manager. The manager, a middle-aged woman with a stern expression, looked her over. Wait, aren't you that woman who did that horrible thing to her daughter? She asked. Yes, but I've paid my debt. I just need a chance. Mrs. Thompson replied, her voice breaking. We can't hire someone like you. It would be bad for business. I'm sorry, but you'll have to leave, the manager said, turning away.